work starting to look like? Sure. All right. There we go. And a big shift in what we see coming in the way of work is this fourth industrial revolution. Have you guys heard that term before? So when we think about we were an agricultural society, then we became an industrial society, and then we became a knowledge society, and now we're starting to become a digital society. So the economy is now based on a completely different paradigm, and obviously what work is shifting as well. So when we think about things like digital transformation that are driven by this, this side, oh, there we go. All right, so driven, it's just backwards, so what I would have expected.
You want me to drive?
No, that, all right, that's okay, I'll
figure it out.
Okay, or you can,
Tell me what.
All right, I'll tell you what. All right, so hold on a second. We can go keep that one here. So when we look at digital transformation, the way that computers are starting to take over the rudimentary work that we did. How many of you work with Revit? Is that something, or AutoCAD? Okay, AutoCAD. All right. So how many of you? Because I actually have an engineering degree from, let's just say, a few years ago. How many of you started with a drafting board? Okay, and now look at what AutoCAD does. So, and you think about how all of that transformation changes the way you work. How many of you would go back to working on a drafting board? Like, yeah. I mean, there's some things that you can do, but obviously the efficiency of technology driving the way that you work obviously has a profound impact on your efficiency. As we look at computers getting smarter and smarter, it's going to start taking over the rudimentary jobs that we do. So, people are concerned about, robots taking over jobs. The estimate that's out there is only about 15% of jobs out there are going to be eliminated in the next 10 years. 60% are going to be revamped. And then there's probably those 15% that are going to go away or going to be replaced with jobs that don't exist today. So when you ask kids today what they want to be when they grow up and they say, I don't know, it's because they're going to grow up and invent those jobs because they don't exist today. So when you think about 60% of the jobs we have are going to be augmented by technology, what happens now in any organization is the value you bring is not sitting and processing information, because it's anything that's repetitive, the machine is going to figure out how to do that for you faster and more accurately. So in order for organizations to really thrive, it's starting to change what we think about what work is, because it's about creative problem solving. And so one of the things that we start to see this big trend is if we're trying to solve problems, we do that together, because there's nothing you can do by yourself anymore. Even when Edison invented the light bulb, nobody ever talks about the entourage of people behind him that helped him because he got all the credit. But all those things that people invented by themselves have kind of been invented. And so business issues become so complex that it requires multiple people, so it goes back to it takes a village to really get things done. So one of the things that we see, why do people want to go to work is because of who is there. So as much as companies for a period of time thought the best way to save money was to send people home to work. And pretty much all of the companies that sent people home to work have now brought them back to work because they realized all the people working by themselves really didn't contribute a whole lot to the organizations. They did their busy work and not a whole lot more. And so the idea of going to work is really becoming a big shift. So those companies that they were saving all kinds of, saving money on the real estate are now realizing that they're losing money on innovation because it takes people coming together to really drive innovation. The original paradigm that we had in the office was we always had thought about where I work. And so probably 90% of the real estate was all allocated to workstations and private offices. And basically the allocation was driven by entitlement, not because of what you needed, but it's because you needed to make people feel really important. And if you were a bigger deal, you wanted to make them feel more important, so you gave them more ceiling tiles. So, you know, we started with this idea that work was, I sit at my desk and I do my job, and you know, and if I keep doing it correctly, I get to keep my job, and I make a career out of being task-centric. That doesn't really work anymore. So we started to see how working together as a team, and with more collaboration, started to be a way to be more creative and to solve problems. You know, you increase the value of the answers, you increase the innovation, and so we started to see more group work. And of course, the pendulum to some degree swung all the way to the other side, where, well, if a little collaboration is good, a lot of collaboration was going to be better. So if you're sitting in workstations and you're separated by panels, we should just shove you all in a room like this so you can work shoulder to shoulder, and that way you can all collaborate, except that you would never collaborate sitting in a room like this. So this idea that we just shove everybody in, and real estate people get gold stars for cramming more people into their buildings because they get the gold star for reducing real estate. The fact that none of you can get your work done isn't their problem. That's management's problem. You know, but hey, you know, we took so much square footage out of the portfolio, so that's good. So now what we start to see is this shift to how do people really start to work together. And the model we see going towards the future is this idea that if I'm spending so much time with my team, and the value we create is significantly greater than the value I create, why don't I just spend most of my time working together as a team? And so we think about the me within the we space, because we know that we still have this dynamic of creative thinking that has to ebb and flow between work that we do individually to work we do collaboratively. And the creative process really requires a different kind of mindset, because you do go in and out of that. So when people talk about, you know, I ask companies, they say they want more collaboration, and it's like, okay, well, first you have to start with socialization. You have to have a network. But no, we don't want people talking to each other. We have people working together. Like, well, people don't know each other. You don't trust each other. And if you don't trust each other, you're not going to collaborate. So this idea of creating these team-based settings is really about creating a lot of awareness about what we're all doing. And we start to see companies actually changing the way they manage performance. And so it's great to have, you know, those cowboys that are always, you know, taking care and like running everything and taking accountability. That's becoming less and less interesting to corporations and other enterprises, because no one person can drive solutions. And so what we start to see now is, you know, where the team-based performance is starting to really change those dynamics rather than the individual-based performance. So, the idea that collaboration is critical is really about knowledge transfer, because you all know little pieces, but until you thread all those pieces together, it doesn't do anybody any good. And so what we really need to see is how does collaboration happen more organically? So when companies want, organizations are looking for more collaboration, we have to be really careful. It's not more meetings. Meetings don't tend to be very collaborative. If you think about all of you in here, like Brandon mentioned about, we talk about this as being something that's informative. You can sit and listen, but if I were to start to like, well, what do you all think? Maybe one of you will pipe up, and maybe some of you won't, but you're not going to have anything really constructive with this many people in the room. And there's actually a little, if you look at communication that happens with the size of a group, obviously the larger the group, the more disinformation happens. Because if there's only 2 of you talking, information goes back and forth. If there's 3 of you, and so if there's 4, so that curve of communication goes up logarithmically. So when you get to more than 8 people in a conversation, you have 264 points of potential miscommunication. You go up to above that, and it starts to get astronomical. So why do small teams, why are small teams more successful? Because you can keep 4 or 5 people on the page and keeping things together. So, okay, you go to the next one. So what happens in most organizations is they're not really set up for collaboration. They're set up for meetings, which means you have lots of big conference rooms, But when you think about where collaboration actually happens, it's probably 2, 3, 4 people in the average meeting. I was at, let's just say, a big hospital system on the west side of the state, and we did an occupancy study for their, for all of their sort of behind the curtain, off the carpet, the carpet side. That's I get that thing, the carpet side. And they're complaining about we don't have enough conference rooms, except that they're always booked, and the rooms like this generally have no more than 4 people ever in them. So that's just one of those things. So there's not a great place for people to connect. There's not ways to get there. So they actually have challenges. So we did a study, and actually this is a study we did in the last 6 months. So this is actually hot off the press. But we looked at 6 countries and 3,000 participants to understand what the challenges are around collaboration. And one of the things the biggest issue is access to people. So particularly when you have distributed teams. So you may all sort of work here, but what do you do when somebody's teleworking or somebody's actually working on one of the other properties? And even with the size of your campus, how do you deal with people who are in those different facilities when you actually need to get them? So if people are traveling back and forth, 2 ships passing in the night. So trying to have access to people is an incredibly important issue in getting that. And so this is where technology can make a huge difference, because not everybody can always be present, physically present, but can you be digitally present? And so being able to start to connect. How many of you use FaceTime? Okay, so FaceTime allows you to have this great connection. And what's really funny, particularly in the Midwest, when I talk to companies like this and organizations about using video conferencing, it's like absolutely not. We hate it. But they'll FaceTime. Like, all right, well, you'll do it with people but all of a sudden at work, it's like, oh no. That's not necessarily the right thing to do. But yet, so much information is transferred visually. So if you're talking to someone and you're trying to explain an issue, how do you really know they understand? They go, and they have no clue what you're talking about. But at least if you could see them, with their eyes rolling, you kind of get that, you get a sense of where this is going. So aside from having access to people, access to information, and this is where we start to see this shift to cloud-based records management. And the hospital, I'm sure, is that if they're using Epic here. I mean, the reason that things like Epic exist is because everybody needs access to all the information. And so one of the challenges, especially with teamwork, is how does everybody know what everybody else knows? And so in order for a team to be successful, you have to have this shared understanding and this shared learning and making that shared thinking much more visible. You also need to have the ability to take information and archive it and retrieve it. Because it's great that you've got content, but if it's somewhere out there, or it's on your hard drive, but the rest of the team needs those files, having it on your hard drive doesn't really help the rest of the team. So we start to see how technology is going to make a huge difference in how we just manage information. Then technology and software are not compatible. So every company deals with this, whether it's not enough Wi-Fi, the bandwidth isn't good enough, you're on different kinds of platforms, you have people in different parts of the organization using different kinds of software. Some of you are on Mac, some of you on Microsoft-based PCs. There's all kinds of things that challenge individuals with being able to easily connect. So when you walk into a room, even connecting to the projector or the TV in the room, how easy is it to do that? And that's a big challenge pretty much universally. There's very few places I've been to where, hey, we walk in and then all of a sudden the lights turn on and the projector comes up. There's always usually somebody well, somebody has to know how to hook all this up. It's one of the biggest challenges with helping people collaborate. And then meeting room constraints. If you come into this room, you can sit at the table or against the wall. You have 2 choices. So you have the people that are fully engaged, and you have the peanut gallery. And you kind of have like, that's about what you can do here. And so, you know, it's great if this is what you're doing, but you were trying to have some sort of brainstorming session, and you wanted to really encourage lots of activity and people getting up and moving around. This might not be the best place to be able to do that, because it basically encourages you to just go to sit there and fall asleep. Particularly those of you in the back of the room, because you have to, you know, look at your view. It's the back of somebody else's head. So, you know, that's the kind of experience that you get coming into these spaces. So people want to be able to come in and be able to have like the ability to control how that space is going to work based on what they actually want to do. And there you go. So all of these come together because it's not just about one little thing, but how do you create a seamless experience where the space just does what you want it to do, and you don't really have to think about it. You just sort of walk in and things just kind of magically happen, and things are intuitive. And so when you start to bring all of that together, what we're trying to do is basically eliminate all of those distractions. Because if it takes 20 minutes to get your computer up and running, and you've got to call facilities to move something, and all of a sudden somebody's going to run to their desk and find a plug strip. And then, okay, who knows how to adjust the lights, or there's no blinds on the window and it's so bright that we can't see any of the screens. All those things take away from your ability to focus on getting whatever your objective is. So we really want to think about this together, and again, it really is about driving innovation, because it's really about this idea of creative collaboration and trying new things. And if you're focused on looking for the clicker for the projector, or who's got the erasers for the whiteboard, you know, that's just a big distraction away from what you're really trying to accomplish. So as we think about driving towards more innovation, it's really about letting people have a space that encourages innovative behavior. They kind of go together. So if you put people in a room like this where it's really fixed, people aren't necessarily likely to think outside the box because they're stuffed in a box. So why wouldn't you give them an environment that's more like a playground, that allows them to think about the space as not being so precious, that really is about engaging with each other, engaging with the space, so that they can start to engage their minds a little bit differently. And so when what's driving a lot of that, again, as I mentioned with the teamwork, is that you're trying to solve some fairly wicked problems. It's not like, oh, we just need to repaint the bathroom. That's like a no-brainer. But when you think about things like master planning on a facility level for a university hospital, that's a little more complex, and try to pull those things together. So you're also trying to anticipate a future that nobody can tell you what it looks like. Because you're dealing with an institution that is going through massive change, and all they know is that it's changing. And so the world of healthcare is a completely innovative type establishment to begin with, and you're at the back end of it. You're trying to support an organization that's trying to be innovative, and you're trying to keep up right behind them, but that becomes a challenge in and of itself because they don't know where they're going. They're reinventing themselves all the time. So how are you supposed to have a crystal ball and plan for their future when they don't know what their future looks like? So it becomes this huge challenge. So not only is the work becoming more complex, it's the fact that you're distracted. And people worry about individual distractions, but think about being distracted as a team. So if you're on a project with some of your coworkers and all the other things that are taking your attention away from the objective for the team. So one of the things we see shifting in this idea of this high-performing teams is taken from, if you're familiar with Agile, that in the world of IT, where software developers are doing much more team-based work. It's really about having teams that are dedicated on solving one or two things at a time, rather than multitasking. And I know that in your world, that's not really practical. But as you start to break down activities, when you start to be able to focus on getting one thing done at a time, you tend to be more efficient, the same way that people, think about multitasking on a personal level. So there's all this other stuff that's taking over for what we want to look at. And then the time that people have to work by themselves. Because people don't necessarily start to collaborate and start to share ideas until they have them. So people need to have that mental time to sort of have those ideas and to bring those forward so that they have something to get you to react to. So we know that that ebb and flow of the work that I do by myself has to contribute to the work that we do together. And then information persistence, this idea of how to stay in the loop. How do you know where my project's going? And how do we share information so that it can be readily apparent? And one of the things I brought up more here last time is a study we did with University of Michigan, where we actually tested the value of having a co-located team in a room where they put everything up on the walls, and that team stayed in that room to work on the project. Another team was given the exact same assignment, but no room and no space. So they had to pack up, and every time they were finished and start over again, and naturally the people that were co-located, had that team, finished the project in like half the time. And so we actually did it with a project here. So it was we had a controlled group and we had a performance group. So we actually from a research paper, U of M's finest researchers were involved with that. So this idea of information persistence is a key, has a huge impact on team performance. Because every time you come in, you start the day knowing exactly where you left off, and your teammates kind of know where everything is going. And then the idea of we have stifled collaboration is all of those things that get in the way of communication and sharing information, or even whether it's access to people, it's access to information. Things like presence disparity. Well, okay, somebody's working from home today. Well, I really need to help. They need their help with something, but we're really not quite getting there, and the technology's not working. So we're not necessarily being as efficient as we possibly could. And then when we drive towards how these spaces could actually work better, this is a little exercise we actually did with the planning team, to think about how space can impact creativity. And through the research that we've done looking at how teams perform, we look at these 6 dimensions. So we talk about things like co-creation. How do people start to think through new ideas? Is it a one-on-one conversation, which is typically where it starts, and then that the idea starts to get some feet? So you start with something that is fairly fragile. Somebody's got an idea, they've got a hunch, they share with somebody else, and like that hunch gets a little stronger, and then eventually that idea has, turns into something, and then you start to bring in other people. So when you start to look at that process of idea generation, and when we think about creativity, it's about problem solving. So when people think, hear creativity, it's like, oh yeah, I have a little Pinterest board, and I have, it becomes sort of this aesthetic thing. And really, creativity is about constructive problem solving. And so if you're thinking about co-creation, it could be about a process. It could be about, in your case, about a physical space. It could be about the way you do something. It could be about how you interface with your client. So all of those have opportunities to be reinvented so that you can create a better outcome. But you start again with thinking about what is that process of driving innovation, and thinking about how you start with a blank sheet of paper. And one of the things, again, that comes out of that agile process is that you're starting to really focus on the problem and really understanding the problem before you go after the solution. So, and very often, people want to start with the solution, and then you just sort of drive there. So you developed all your specifications, and you think about building a hospital. When you do programming for the hospital, how long does it take to build one? Okay, so you start programming a space that you're not going to be into for 5 years, and you expect nothing's going to change in 5 years? did, in Canada they have these sort of P3 things where it's like public money, private money, and then I forgot what the third one was. But I worked with a hospital there where they had done the program. They were actually building the facility 8 years after the programming was done. Yes. And the programming was done by one design firm. The schematic design was done by a second design firm, and the CDs were done by a third firm with programming that was 8 years old. So when I was asked to like help them evaluate it, like what they were building had nothing to do with what the objective of, I mean, it was clinical space, which was fine, but they wanted, but you have this huge disconnect between what you really need and what somebody told you 8 years ago you should have. And like, well, we're stuck with it because the building's already being up and we can't make any changes. So like, all right, well, you have a building that, you have an antiquated building that you haven't even moved into. But that's sort of the downside of that whole waterfall process of thinking, what do you want at the end rather than thinking at the beginning, what are we trying to solve for? And that is where experimentation comes in, because innovation is driven by trying things that you don't know are going to work. If you know it's already going to work, you're just doing the same thing over and over again, which is why all of our offices look the way they do, because we started that paradigm 50 years ago based on how many ceiling tiles do people need, and we just kept putting everybody in there because nobody wanted to do anything different. And every time somebody thought it was something, well, if we change this, we don't know if it's going to work. Well, finally, some people got brave enough to change those things and found out, guess what? It actually works better. And so this idea of experimentation is about taking those, looking at things you haven't done before, prototyping those things, and measuring where they do. So in the world of environments, companies and organizations get really sort of skeptical about, well, should we change our environment? Like, did you ever try it and measure it? And so nobody ever thinks about applying their innovation process to the world of facilities. It's like, well, in the world of healthcare, they're always trying something new, and there's trials and tests, and you make sure that, before you do this mass scale output of changing the way you practice healthcare, you're pretty sure it works. But somehow when it gets into facility, nope, we're fine with what we have. And we know it doesn't work, but that's okay because we don't know what will work. Like, well, you need to try something. So helping people sort of understand that it's okay to fail because you learn from those failures. But if you don't fail, you've never tried anything new. And that's really hard for organizations to grasp, particularly in healthcare, because failure is not like a really good thing in healthcare. But in the world of facilities, it's like, well, you can manage the risk, but it really is about risk management. Autonomy is about pushing decision-making down to the people that actually know what's going on. So when you have these hierarchical organizations, this happens a lot, particularly with let's just say engineering organizations where decisions always have to go up to the top of the organization because they don't trust the people who actually worked on the problem to actually know what's best. And so we start to see how organizations are shifting to let the people who actually know most about the problem solve the problem. And so it's about giving that sense of control back to the users. The social connections, how do you build networks? Because you never know who's going to be the best resource for a project you're working on, because you all come with a very diverse perspective, very diverse experience, and you never know who might be the great addition to the team if you don't know people. And so building those networks is all about those social connections, because if you're working together with people on a project, you tend to work with those people, and that's who you know. But you start, one of the things about companies like Facebook and Google, one of the reasons that they feed people 3 times a day is to build those networks, because they know those people can get really tied up. Like, I know the people right around me, but you never know who those other 4,000 people are on campus who could really be a huge asset. And so we start to see the value where that turns into the value of crowdsourcing. How do I throw something out to the group and think that, wow, if I have a problem, I can send some sort of communication to the whole group, and people know who I am and are willing to sort of like help me to solve that. those mental shifts, we talk a little bit about the I work and the we work, is that we cycle through that, and everybody cycles differently at different times of the day, the way that whether they're more introverted or extroverted, the kind of work that they're doing. But the paradigm of the old office was we had a desk in an office or a workstation, and then we had a conference room. And so we expected people to do all of their work from one spot. And it never worked. I mean, the biggest complaint we had 20 years and 30 years ago in the office was, it's noisy. We took down the panels, it's still noisy. But yet, we still don't necessarily think about the activities that people are doing and what they really need. And so we give, idea of giving people more choice. And the last one, visualization. How do people see what's going around them so they're immersed in their content? Because we know that information persistence actually drives performance. So the shift that we see, if you can go to the next one, is spaces that are designed to encourage all of those characteristics. So when we think about experimentation, being able to come in and move stuff around just changes people's behavior about, I'm not stuck here, so if I have a place to sit in my little table here, how creative am I going to be? But if I can go in and I can start to move things around, I become actively involved with my place. And that is just enough sometimes to encourage people, well, if I can move my chair, why can't we move the wall? Or why can't we relocate, or why can't we do something? Because you're just inciting that kind of behavior. If you look at things like visualization, making group thinking very apparent. So the idea of doodling on the whiteboard, rather than just simply debating something, everybody's sitting around and you're going back and forth, when you write it down, just the simple act, that mechanical transition of going from your brain to the board, and having, whether you're writing it or people are watching you write it, makes an indelible mark in your brain more than just having that conversation. And so making that thinking visible is a really key part, particularly with brainstorming. How do you follow that thread? Because all of a sudden you get people like going back and forth, and the conversation's getting really, really interesting, but nothing's being documented. And you get to the end of the conversation and like, okay, so what did we just talk about? And you lose all that momentum. But documenting it is really important, particularly when we think about co-creating or generating new content. If it's there, it's much easier to go back to and reflect on it. And then having it there and having it persistent means that you can go through this brainstorming session. And one of the mistakes that people make is, we're going to go do this brainstorm. We get all these ideas, and you talk about there's no bad ideas, and you're looking, going, well, some really are, but that's okay. But then you stop right there and go, okay, so what do we see? And you start to make those correlations without letting your brain sort of let it simmer, because we know the best part of your brain to do that really creative thinking, you can't access. It's the stuff that why you have those best ideas when you're walking the dog and unloading the dishwasher, because you're not focused on that, and so that limbic region of your brain can actually process that information. So when you do that brainstorming and you see all that stuff on the wall and you come back the next day, that's when you make all those really good insights. Because if you look at what's on the wall and you start to think about, okay, so what do we do next? You typically will pick the things that are most familiar, because those are the things you did before. Well, this worked last time. Like, well, you just defeated the whole purpose of the brainstorming because you're going back to the same behavior rather than taking the time to let your brain process what's there. And then even for the mind shifts that are here, letting people sort of maneuver in and out. So that there's times where people might want to sit and just kind of do a little bit of thinking by themselves, as well as coming together and working on things collectively. And then even when you think about it doesn't show a lot of technology here, having both digital and analog combined in there so that you can start to connect with places, with people that aren't even in the room. So things like the Surface Hub that is in the back of the room and that are in the mill, it's not just a whiteboard, it's not just a display, but it's a really effective digital tool about connecting people and connecting them to information. And that's really a key factor in sort of driving that performance. So when you think about, creating these spaces that are there to really encourage a very different kind of behavior, it's not a space to have a meeting like this. Because you could all, have sat at your desk and we could have just beamed all of this in. If the teams worked like it's supposed to, you could have just sat there, put on your headset and watched. That wouldn't have been terribly engaging either. But when we think about how you come into a space like the mill, which is, it has some characteristics that are in here, it's about going in and, setting up the room for what you need it to do for whatever, the size of the group, the kind of activity that you're going to be doing, and take advantage of it. So when we get back to this idea of experimentation, when you go into the room for the first time, don't just take the room at face value, because it's going to be, the furniture's already going to be in there. It's going to be set up in some way. Don't just assume that it was set up for you, because it probably wasn't. It was set up for whoever was there last. And so experiment with the room. Experiment with the technology. Try those things. And some of you, are going to be really comfortable, like, yeah, we need to go all of this. And some of you are going to try to use the technology, and it's going to fail miserably. That's part of experimentation. Sometimes it fails. But you need to keep, look for some help. There's people around to sort of take care of that. But think about that room as an experiment for yourselves that's going to be there to encourage a different kind of activity. So hopefully you'll get a chance to, go and take advantage of it. And, do it with one or two people, do it with a bigger group. The more you start to use it, some of you are going to find it a little weird, a little uncomfortable, but there's a learning curve that goes along with any time you're introduced to something new. And so, part of our consulting practice is a lot of change management. And we see companies give employees these great new places to work that nobody ever uses because nobody taught them how to use the space. In this case, you should be the guinea pigs and try it for yourself, and develop those protocols for yourselves. How would you want to use it? And some of you are going to find like this is great for this kind of meeting. Sometimes that may not be the right place for that kind of meeting, but you need to keep trying them because obviously this is an experiment. If it works, how do you replicate this on a bigger scale and start to understand what about it is actually working really, really well? And then over time, what are the things that you can, it's an iterative, experimentation, it's an iterative process. It's designed with the best intent, but that doesn't mean it's perfect. And this is a chance that this is the whole point of experimentation and creating new spaces, is now you've got your own experiment to try to look at and try to move forward with. So I'll turn it over back to Brandon. I guess you have a couple of follow-ups. So any questions about what I make sense? So, all right, thank you.
All right, so and this will be very quick, and then we have time blocked as well for really just open discussion. It doesn't have to be necessarily questions pertaining to just the content we saw, but it can really be anything at all that we might have that we want to entertain in some dialogue about with Richard about the change management, collaboration, spaces like the mill, spaces like those that he pictured, that we can have some takeaways from as a group. But as far as the upcoming activities go, so we find ourselves here with the keynote presentation in the open house that we're going to be going over to in a little bit. In the next few weeks, we're going to be finalizing the actual functional training that we're putting together for the mill itself, okay? A lot of that is going to tie into the technology, the surface hubs that are in there, the lighting, where you can find replacement candy and water, really straight up traditional things so that if you were going to use the room for the first time, you know right where to go to get what you need to be able to utilize it, okay? But I think the big takeaway that we just heard, so much about that room is just one big experiment, right? And those who, from the planning team that have brought some folks in there and been working with it, they're finding things that are working great. they're finding things that aren't really working well. And I think what that's already resulting in is our own little to-do list of some course correction for us to be able to put into place to be able to make the room that much more dynamic for a wider range of purposes than we even imagined. So the training sessions are taking place between December 5th and the 13th. And then our planning team has earmarked the week of December 16th for the actual demo week activities. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the things that we have planned and what we're going to do during demo week during the actual training. But that's going to be additional hands-on experimentation in the room with some pre-planned things that the planning team has thought up that relates to each of your disciplines around the room. So in other words, they tried to think through, as an electrical engineer, something I might be doing in that space with a team. And so a lot of the inspiration for Demo Week is around specific things that those types of groups can think about having really great applicability in a space like that versus, say, a conference room like this that we find ourselves standing in. Okay? Any questions on any of that? Where we're going? Okay. So I think what we wanted to do, we had about a half-hour block. We're running actually a little bit of ahead of schedule, which is strange. Usually we're running behind. So we don't need to take 40 minutes necessarily, but we can open it up for any conversation points or additional questions that anybody has, and then I think we can just have some dialogue as a team. So with that, I'll open it up and see what you guys are thinking about.
I have a question.
Sure.
Rich, so are you seeing other hospitals co-locate any of their teams? I know we're like planning, facilities, space planning, that kind of thing, but I'd be interested to hear at the other hospital on the west side of the state, if they're embracing the co-location and hyper-collaborative environment.
Yes.
Okay.
And this is not the University of Michigan connection.
Okay.
Not that hospital.
Okay.
No, they actually are experimenting. They call it an experiment, and they took their real estate and facilities group, put them into an area where they are testing unassigned seats for all of their project managers and their lease managers and their space planners are all now in a space that is, they went to technically 100% unassigned. And that was sort of the premise of, let's just put it and see what happens. And they found there were a handful of people that really didn't like the whole unassigned thing because there was one person who does all of the contracts, who like has all the contracts, and she sits at her desk all the day managing contracts. So she was not really mobile. Some of the PMs love the fact that they could work anywhere because they come in. They said it actually. They felt like it was perfectly, because they didn't have an assigned seat, they didn't feel obligated to just show up. So they would spend time on site, wherever they're, whatever site they might be working with, and they would just bring their laptop, and they felt it was okay to work at the site for the rest of, they might have a couple of meetings, but it was okay to stay there because it wasn't like they had to show up at their desk to be present because they didn't have a desk there. So they felt a lot freer and a lot more productive because they didn't feel like they had to be going back and forth. So it's one of the things that they're sort of learning from that. Some of the teams are more collaborative. So you've got space planners that may be working with the project managers. The real estate people tend to kind of do their own thing, managing the portfolio. But it is something that we're starting to see more of that. That the business of the hospital, all the stuff that's behind the curtain, there's more of an interest in bringing that up to speed because even we see this, and my vantage point, it's like retail. Stores spend 99% of their energy on the stores. In fact, you're familiar with Meyer, which is based in Grand Rapids. We did a project for them a few years ago, and the sentiment from the employees that were in corporate headquarters were, we wish the company treated us like we're supposed to treat customers. And they realized that, okay, you can't expect the staff to be customer focused if we're not thinking of them as an audience. And I think we're starting to see a little bit of that in healthcare, where you put so much emphasis on the hospitals, the clinicians, the medical staff, because they're the ones that are out facing the public, except that there's a huge contingency that makes that work. And so there's more interest now in making sure that the back end is supporting the front end, because it was always sort of this afterthought. So we are seeing that. So my activity in healthcare over the last year has, I don't know if it's a coincidence, but it's ramped up.
Skyrocketing.
Yeah, yeah. So, but it's on the administrative side. I'm not I don't know anything about the clinical side, other than I did a project for a psychiatric hospital, but that was relatively safe. That didn't require like equipment.
Well, thank you.
Sure.
What's Avery thinking about?
A question. So as you're designing these office type spaces, do you find that companies are being sensitive to different working styles? So I agree that collaborative spaces are great, but there are some times when I can't have anybody around if I'm going to focus on this project. It's just my working and learning style.
Yeah. So there's a big shift to, one of the ways of describing it is activity-based planning. And there's more acknowledgement that people do work differently. And the paradigm of the office for years has always been you gave everybody the same thing because it made it easy for you to move people around. The fact that it didn't work for people had nothing to do with why we created spaces. It was all about efficient space planning. And so there's more recognition that individuals work differently, and it's how much time they spend focusing by themselves or working collaboratively. There are people who are hypersensitive to noise, who can't, like if I hear, we get this all the time, the office should be perfectly quiet, but it's an office. There are people working there, people at work talk to each other, so like the idea of it, the office, now that doesn't mean some people need quiet to be able to focus. The ability to give people that kind of quiet and isolation in the workplace is never going to happen in a workstation. I mean, people have been complaining about noise ever since we put workstations in. And no matter what you do with the workstation, there's going to be noise. So rather than trying to fix the workstation, people are the most flexible part of an office. People can get up and move, but you have to give them a place to move to. So what we start to see is this shift in the real estate allocation, where people have big workstations because you expected them to do everything in that workstation. You could have a small meeting in your workstation, so you had to have a guest chair. You were supposed to have phone calls in your workstation. You're supposed to do your heads down work in your workstation, except that it was never designed it was never optimal for any of those things. So what the shift we start to see is giving people enough room to do their basic work so they can get most of their stuff done, but then they have access to other places. So if you really need to do something and not be disturbed, there's a place to go. If you need to have a one-on-one, there's a place to go. And so even when we think about companies getting rid of private offices, the big drive in that is how much real estate it takes, especially if you're an organization. Because I worked with a hospital system where this was the insurance. Well, it was the back end of the system, but their building standards, they had 6 sizes of private offices based on your pay grade. The likelihood that your inventory matches your organization is never going to happen. So like, okay, so you get 2 windows or 3 windows or 4 windows or a corner, and so we made the plan we devised for them was get rid of all the offices on the windows and go to one size office for everybody, which they're actually doing, which was kind of amazing that they actually looked at that. But it solved a whole bunch of other problems. But we don't necessarily challenge if people need an office. We challenge whether they need to own the office. So if people do, everybody needs privacy or isolation depending upon what they're doing. But privacy should not be a hierarchical asset. everybody, what do you do if, you're out in the open plan and you need to call the doctor to make an appointment? Or you need to check in with the kids to make sure they get off the bus. So you need to be able to have those options. So we see how real estate allocation is shifting so that there's less real estate allocated to what somebody might own to provide room for all those other shared amenities. So when we think about those shared spaces, they're private spaces, they're group spaces, they're social spaces that everybody gets to use, which is also about driving those social connections. People spend more time in those in those communal areas, which is also a huge driver from younger generations. Baby boomers would love to just sit in their office with their door shut and be very task-centric and be totally isolated. You now have younger talent moving into the workplace that, I don't know if you saw the last articles, they're really annoyed with baby boomers not retiring because it's limiting their career advancement. So there's all these articles that just came out in the last couple of weeks about where the baby boomers just get over themselves and retire and get out of our way.
Yeah, right.
But you've got a generation that, if you think about Uber and Airbnb, this gig economy of sharing everything, like they don't want to own a car, they don't want to own a house. They just want to be able to move around and have that flexibility. So for this younger talent moving into the workforce, they're not motivated by the same things that potentially people who may have been with the organization for 87 years have. So that's another big driver towards this idea of giving people the right place when they need it.
What is the plan for the stuff? 50% of my office is stuff. File cabinets full of files and projects and blue folders. And they're collaborative. The paperless environment has come and gone. Jack Welch tried it and it didn't work too well for GE.
Well, GE is pretty much, for the most part, GE is fairly paperless now. I mean, not everything. So what do you use in those files?
All the notes from the last project and the last 4 years worth of project, but then once they get beyond 4 years, then what do you do with this stuff? It becomes like a hoarding habit.
And that's what it is hoarding. Is it really valuable? And so things that are valued become digitized. And so so it's not that the records go away, but they become digital records, not paper records. So people tend to use paper for active work. People will print things because they need to read it, which is, okay, in the thing, you need drawings because you're marking up drawings. So, in the architecture field, I don't know how, and there are firms that are trying to become paperless. AECOM, there's one they have a mandate to be paperless, and I know a bunch of people who work there. Like, she's a civil engineer. She's like trying to, I'm not quite sure how this is really going to work. But if you think about why do you need all those flat files, because once you redline the drawing, you update the file at the end of the project, why do you don't need to, all that stuff is there, so you don't need that much storage. The same thing that happens with personal, in your office or your workstation. What we tend to see if you do an inventory is stuff that's been there for more than 4 years, or it's personal stuff. And while personalization is important to a lot of people at work, you can probably pare it back a little bit. Some people could pare it back a lot. Do you need the entire Star Wars diorama, with the little doilies and the lights and the whole bit? So there's still, people still want to have a sense of identity at work, which you can still do, which is potentially scaling it back. And thinking about what information really needs to be archived, and then even when you think about personal storage versus communal storage. So storage, when you talk about how many files are in your office or in a workstation, storage in a workstation takes up a ridiculous amount of space and is incredibly inefficient. Group storage, however, is incredibly more efficient. So you can actually shrink the size of a workstation and still give people storage. It might not be like right there, it might be over here. But for things that you just need to know where it is, not stuff you use every day, it tends to work really well. The other thing that we start to see is you make people more mobile, they become less and less dependent on paper. And we prototyped this with our sourcing group. Probably 10 years ago, we did our first mobility study, and there was our sourcing procurement group was about 90 people, and every time we added somebody, there was no place to sit because all the workstations were occupied, and our VP of sourcing would be like, okay, we have, call facilities, we need a workstation. Like, well, there's no place, but there's nobody here, like, because they're all occupied, just not present. So 45 of those people offered to be mobile workers and give up their own workstation. And we started by giving them a big rolling, it was like a rolling tower. There was a garage and they could put all their stuff, and it was like this tall and weighed about, 100 pounds, 200 once it got loaded. But they could carry, all their stuff was in there, and they could, when they came in, they could drag it to wherever they were working. Within 2 weeks, the little carts never left the garage. Within another month or two, they never accessed them. So it took some time, but for people who become really that mobile, they start to learn how to become completely digital. So if I can't carry it in my backpack, I don't need it. And so I don't archive. I still need things that are active files because I'm working on this right now, but I don't archive anything. It's all digitally archived. And then when you start to think about team dynamics, those files in your office don't do the team any good because they're in your office. So for teams to really work well together, all that information needs to be accessible to the team. So therefore, having it in your file doesn't do anybody else any good. So that shift in how do you access information is driving, again, that digital shift away from I can't keep the paper, because if I'm the one with the paper, nobody else can use it.
Go ahead. I was just going to add on real quick a story about the Mayo Clinic. They're a great customer of ours, and they had taken an initiative to they wanted to evaluate the role of the physician private office, and they did a sensor study. First, they went to the physicians and said, you have, some of they have multiple offices at different buildings, and they said, we need to reduce this or get rid of it, and the physicians, of course, pushed back. And so they did a sensor study and found that on average the physicians were in their offices 13% of the time. And so they said, we can't really justify the cost associated with this as an organization when you're only there for 13% of the time. And the physicians all said, well, so what? I want my office, and I'm not going to get rid of my office.
That's what I expect them to say.
Yes. So this was driven from the executive level. So the executives at that time were consolidating. They were kind of dispersed across the campus. So they were consolidating into one location. And so they decided, it's pretty difficult to ask somebody else to do that when we're not doing it ourselves. Let's give it a try. So we worked with them. They consolidated their offices into one location and went to 100% unowned. So, nobody had a private office. It was one open space with a multitude of choice and control options for accommodating, the type of work that they're doing, the different work styles. The only people that had a owned space, and that was the administrative assistants who were basically, parked there most of the day. And the biggest resistor to that was the CFO, who had one of these offices with tons of paper, just like piled up and all over like those professors' offices, excessive. And I toured the space, and as we were leaving one night, we went in after hours, and he went in, he was coming out of the space, came in, and we ran across him. And he said, I never thought I could work like this. And he said, I was the one who was the biggest resistor. I didn't want anything to do with this. And he said, after I worked in this it had been about 6 to 8 months, he said, I could never imagine working any other way. I'm so much more efficient. We make decisions faster. I can see my peers. We are collaborating, we're innovating, we're doing creative work, etc. So that's an example of somebody, a different level, but still somebody who was very paper-based, who went to, that, and it is, or it still comes down to that, how do we manage that change? But I think it's every organization is, it plagues every organization and any change, whatever it might be. But I thought I'd share that since it was another healthcare organization. There were some other questions.
With how rapidly changing work environments are currently, and with having no idea where we're going, what approach do you see places taking in trying to do something like building a new hospital? Even knowing that spaces from 5 years ago are potentially half the size today as they were then, and when you're building something that's a 12-story building that takes 5 years of planning, where do you start even thinking about where you're going? You have no idea to know where you're going.
Sure. Which is the tricky question. So I can talk on the corporate side. I'm not going to. The hospital thing is a little trickier. On the worker side, one, planning for resiliency to begin with. So you're not creating an environment that you think you're future-proofing by coming up with a solution that you anticipate is going to be future-proof, because it's not. But you're developing a solution that is flexible, that can change over time. And if also, when you start designing for people, people and process, that's very different, because how people and how they work will evolve. People aren't going to evolve. So if you start with people and you start about things like sort of basic well-being and cognitive function, so some of the things that we look at are things like work modes. We know that people are always going to be doing focused work by themselves. They're going to be doing work with other people. They need to be able to socialize. They need to be able to, rejuvenate. If you create spaces for that, it doesn't matter what they're doing, but we know people are going to need time to work by themselves. That's never going to go away. But when you start to design spaces that are looking at the function, that's when you miss, because the function's going to evolve. If you think about, I need to be able to shut the door, or I want to sit somewhere where I can put my feet up, because that's where I'm going to be more comfortable. When we look at those behaviors, those behaviors are always there. We just never allow a lot of people to do that. So what we're actually now doing is allowing people to work the way they've always wanted to. But if we start with people first, and the fact that they need to work by themselves and work collaboratively, those are some basics that are never going to change. So we think about how do we create spaces that we know inherently can change over time. So we think about less fixed architecture and more things that have become more flexible, things that are more multi-purpose rather than really specific. Because how people might want to use a kind of space, we shouldn't dictate. Why couldn't you have a potluck in here? There's no reason that you couldn't. But if you think about, well, this is a conference room, we can't use this as a social space, you've now limited the ability to use this room for other purposes. So the more we create spaces that have less of a definition to them, that again, we know we want people to come together, that should dictate, that's a premise that's never going to go away. So we're planning spaces that are intentionally going to change over time, because we can't anticipate what it's going to be. So because we get this all the time, we want to future-proof the building. We want a solution today that we know is going to work for the next 10 years. And we always ask the client, well, what is your work process going to look like in 10 years? Well, we don't know. Well, then how do you expect us? Or people like, what does the office of the future look like? Where are you starting? Because what your office of the future, what your office in 10 years will look like is predicated on what you have now. If you're, somebody that's incredibly contemporary now, it's going to be very different. So the office of the future is going to be different for every organization.
So in healthcare, patient privacy is a huge deal.
Mhm.
Also, staff privacy and confidential documents and information. How is that folded into this scheme?
So managing information, what we start to look at is keeping the content secure, not the people. So you're keeping the privacy and managing the information, not necessarily. So a great example is what we did with our legal team in Grand Rapids. All of their information is in project rooms. The lawyers aren't in an office with all their stuff. So what we did was he took what is confidential is the content. That's all secure. We just let people have access to each other. So it's really about thinking about what is the difference between privacy and confidentiality. And people like to shove those two together. But privacy is a personal issue. I don't want to share something personally. I am disrupted because of visual stimulation or the noise. So people talk about, I need privacy because I need quiet. Quiet and privacy are two different things. So when we look at, particularly in healthcare, it's the information that you need to manage discretion, not the people. So you put, safeguards in place, and for the most part, it's screen content that needs to be confidential or phone conversations. So you still need places for privacy, but not expecting the entire workplace to be private. There's also this sentiment that what is an appropriate level of confidentiality? If all of you are connected to the same case, why do you have to keep it secret from each other? Especially this comes up a lot of times, not so much in hospital, with HR. HR journalists are always like, well, I have to have, I'm working with employee records, so I need confidential. Yes, so are the people, everybody around you is on the same system. They all see the same information. So, okay, no, if you're reprimanding an employee for stealing, you're not going to do that out in the open. So you have places to maintain that level of discretion, but it's about you're managing the content, not the people.
So this is a holistic kind of thinking, not just for the collaborative work that we need to do. Now, the other concern that I have is people are creatures of habit, and they like to have predictability. If I need to print something for a presentation, I need to know when that printer is available and around 9 and all that. But if it's all shared and when I need it, someone else is using it, how is all that resources being managed and how that works in the practical sense? Is that?
Well, it's making sure that you're planning for capacity. So things like printers. I mean, obviously, one of the things, for years people had their own printer at their desk because it was confidential. Like, if I'm printing something, well, it's really easy now. You scan your badge, you type in a code, you print on demand. The other thing that's really interesting, when you start those programs on print on demand, your paper usage goes way down because people print arbitrarily, but all of a sudden if I have to get up and go get it, then I actually think twice. But that you make it part of your well-being program, not your sustainability program. It's like you want people to get up, but that's where planning comes in. So those in this idea of those shared resources become more efficient, and usually those are things that get managed fairly well when you start. Okay, what kind of capacity do you need for things like those shared resources?
So a reminder, we have print on demand at the Konica copier. That's what we talked about, having user boxes. So we already had that set up, and everybody in the room is already set up with a print on demand folder. So you can use that at any time, but if you have any questions about how to use it or how to set your computer up for something else, you can do help.
So, yeah. I mean, all of these things that come up all the time, where, because people are the ultimate ecosystem. There's nothing wrong, there's nothing broken, what are we trying to fix? And this is, again, sort of is the whole definition against, why companies aren't terribly innovative, because you just simply do the same thing over and over again and change. There's a quote we use from the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, that basically when you're young, up to like 10, 12 years old, up to 15 years old, everything in the world is brand new to you. So it's really exciting, and you can get a career out of it. And then between 15 to say 35 or 40, everything that you learn is part of the normal flow. And then once you get older than 35 or 40, everything you learn is useless. Because you just want to coast. You've learned everything you need to know. And so it changes hard to learn, to start to adapt. So anyway,
I'd like to throw this out too. So if any of you have an office that's full of paper and you feel like it's important documentation that you want to keep, I'm speaking to the managers here, so if it's information that you feel like you want to keep, we ask that you go through it first and pull out the things that maybe aren't as useful. The university actually has a group, it's an imaging group, and you can send all the documents to them. They scan it, they digitize it. It's very, very, very inexpensive. We're talking like a penny a page. So it would be a very efficient way for us to get rid of the paper and start moving in a digital direction. So Brian and I can talk to you about that. So if you have an office full of paper that you think it would be beneficial for you to put the projects in a project file and get them digitized, just let your manager know, and if we get enough interest, then we can start getting a program going.
and then you take all the paper and you have a bonfire and you hold hands and you all take a deep breath. You're like, it's okay. It's on the little flash drive.
Any other questions, comments? Okay, why don't we give Richard another round of applause? So before we depart completely, and then for those of you who are interested in spending a little bit of time down in the mill and exploring, touching, feeling, drawing, writing, playing around with the different technologies in this space, I just wanted to show you one thing on the screen as I call down to Kelly to see if the space is ready for us to be able to move from here down to there. And one comment I want to make before I call down there is just so the screen, every screen that we have in there, there's 4 total of them. In the lower left corner, they have a number or a name on them. So there will be 3 screens that we will be keeping here in FPD, okay? Their home is in the mill, but they're extremely portable to be able to move about our offices and connect to our networks. So it took all of 3 minutes to wheel this one down here and plug it in to be able to use it. The 4th screen is named AEC01, and that's going to be the screen that we're going to be transporting over and putting in the trailer with our AEC partners. So it'll probably be in a couple more weeks, I think, and Louise is planning to spend a couple of afternoons over there where he's going to orient and walk through the AEC project managers on how to use the screens and how to call us. But for the sake of this simulation, I'm going to be calling Kelly using this AEC1 screen. And so it really is as easy as selecting AEC on here, and it'll make a phone call over to the trailer. And then when Kelly picks it up on her end, turning it into a full screen mode. And it takes a second for the quality to adjust here, but we can all say hi to Kelly. Hi, Kelly.
Hi, Kelly.
You were supposed to come up with something really cool to say to do. Oh, okay.
You guys can come back though when everything's ready.
Okay.
Check out the room.
All right. Thanks, Kelly. We'll be down in a minute. So I'll let's leave it connected in case, as you guys are playing around, somebody can walk back here. We can talk to somebody in the other room if that's something you wanted to play with. Some of the things that Louise is working on with this is going to be our ability to not just call one another on here, but also share content back and forth. And our hope is that we'll be able to do that using the Microsoft whiteboard that's native, that's on board here to this Surface Hub. But we also want to be able to open up our PDFs out of box, mark them up, share them, and talk about them in real time with each other. Not so dissimilar than what we might do on Blue Jeans or on some of our conference calls, but to be able to do it very nimbly by literally just hitting the button and calling the screen over there, and then opening up the file and then talking about it together on the screen, or talking about it with some of our clinical teams right on the screen. Okay, so that's the idea behind it. So it was kind of fun to be able to call down there and see, and the quality of it's actually quite good. The sound is quite good. The only thing we're running into is this is kind of brand new technology from Microsoft. It seems like there's every other day an update coming out for these where they're trying to fix various bugs that we encounter. So with that, one last comment I'll make as we enter the room down there. Every intentional space associated with the Learning Lab has a little card, either a card on it, it has writing describing the types of things we can do in the space, or there's something interactive going on, okay? So as you enter the space, our planning team, one of the planning team sub-teams, talked about various ritualistic types of things that we might do in the mill. And an example of that is something we're hoping all of you can do as you go down there, and that would be that on the screens right now, they're all currently sharing one whiteboard, okay? And so what we want you to do as you enter the room, or as you get a chance because there's quite a few of us, is to grab the pen and then draw your version of an ideal light bulb on that whiteboard. And then just put your initials or put your last name on it. By the time all 40 of us draw light bulbs on there, some will be of much better quality probably than others, but it's all on one background, one whiteboard that they're all sharing. And we thought that would be kind of a cool thing to kind of recognize the kickoff and the opening of the space. And also something interactive that you can do with the pen and to be able to play around and draw on the screen itself. Aside from that, there's a few other interactive things in there, but I think like Richard said, that the furniture is set up in there, but move it around if you want to. Almost all of it's on wheels. Explore the various spaces. The planning team, the majority of us are going to be down there. We can answer questions that you might have. And then that'll lead us into a few weeks from now when we actually do the formal training on the space. Sound good?
So Brendan,
Yep.
are we able to use this room for our team huddles as of right now? Can we reserve
Yep.
it for Sarah?
Yes, actually that's a
Okay.
great question. So the training that we put you through should result in all of you being very, very capable of not needing much hand-holding at all. But don't feel like you have to wait, thank you April, wait until December, January to reserve the room, okay? It just might mean that in that initial period, if you're like, Brendan, I'm not sure, or Louise or Kelly, I'm not sure how to do something, it's a piece of cake for one of us to come over and show you guys. And that would include move the furniture around if you want to, if you're gonna use it. Use the screens if you want to use them. Draw on the board, build a mock-up, bring teams here. I know some of our planning team has at least 2 or 3 of them have already brought some of their teams in, done activities in the room. All of that we can do now as a part of this sort of initial experimentation phase. Last comment on that, if you want to reserve the room, okay, we do have a panel you'll see outside the room where you can walk up to it, click book. It'll ask you to put a code in. The code is simply 1032, which is the room number, and you'll be able to hold any block of time that you'd like to, okay? A limitation of the room scheduling system is that if you're booking from the panel outside the room, you cannot put your name or a description. It's just gonna hold it, okay? So what we need to do is follow that up with an email to Sarah and just let her know the day and the time that you're trying to block it and what the title is. She'll put it in through the actual scheduling mechanism that controls the room. Okay? I'm gonna make a couple more comments on this that I think are important just as a broad announcement for the group. You can also bypass touching the panel at all and just email Sarah if you want to use the room, and you can skip a whole step there. So you can really do it either way. Second comment related to that. The Evoco system that's on the wall, it is not connected in any way to our Outlooks, okay? Some of that was by design, some of it by just what the capabilities are of the Evoco system. What I mean by that is that room is not a publicly consumable room outside of our office and outside of our project teams, unless we give that permission for it to be used for those purposes, okay? And so if by chance you had a project team out there and said project team wanted to host an event of some kind on their own for their own clinicians, It's not that we would tell them no, you just would need to direct them over to myself. And then I'll be able to talk to them, look at what we have going on and see if I can fit it in, okay? Because as we get going in there and as you guys begin to utilize the space, what I would anticipate would be that we're going to be doing things like mock-ups, setups, simulations, and other types of team-based activities in there. And what I don't want to do is loan the room out for other purposes to where we then might not be able to use it for our teams. And so to that end, as much as I love all of our neighbors in the building, we won't have patient and family clinical meetings and things going on like we sometimes do in our other spaces that they reserve. Okay? Long-winded, but that was a great question to tee that up. Yeah, go ahead.
Have the AEC project managers been offered training in this space? Because I could see them holding design meetings here.
So not yet, but they will.
Okay,
So
great.
our plan was to sort of start internal to FP&D. We've had some external people from pathology that wanted to also come to kind of our training, and what we kind of said is we will replicate said training to everybody who's interested, but we really wanted to kind of put our arms around FP&D and start here, right? Let's get all of our folks acclimated and used to and understanding what the technologies can do and how to use the room, but then we do want to open that up to everybody, primarily including our ADC PMs, but I know our ambulatory care folks were out here to collaborate with us. We showed them the space. They also, their whole team of PMs wants to also get training and be able to use it on projects with their teams as well. Good questions. Did I see another hand? You have a flash? Go ahead, Woody.
I was gonna say, when this goes over to AEC, the one, I think, major difference that I know of, that I believe is capable of, that's different from like Blue Jeans or whatever, is if we pull up a PDF here in our office and then we're sharing it to the screen, not only can we draw on it, but they also can draw on it. And so we truly can work collaboratively, where it's not just me presenting to AEC something on my screen. We have the opportunity to both be there, like we're sitting at the table sketching that on a sheet of paper together. So, and then we can save it and it's available to us.
Yep. And one of the things that we'll talk about, I think, as we do the training and as you guys start to use the space more, is you're going to see a digital screen on the wall as we enter the room. That's going to be, and we're going to let a couple of lines cross here for a minute. That screen is one of the action items from our Voices survey for better communication, feedback, and recognition in the department as well. So the screen serves a lot of purposes. One of them, as you'll walk by, is going to be the recognition of some of the staff who've done some things, project or other related, for either for Michigan Medicine campus or internal to our office. Secondarily to that, though, it's also a digital whiteboard. So it's like one of these flips, but it's just hanging on a wall. So as we do facilitate team activities in there, we also want to collect that PDCA associated with the space. And what your comment made this pop in my head, because I know Steve was in the room with individuals, and when I saw him in there afterwards, I walked in to ask him how it went, and it worked well for Steve, but he did encounter that manipulating and marking up PDFs had some limitations in the very basic function that we have currently set up on these. But the takeaway from that is, that's fine, we can solve that problem. So as you guys go in there and encounter issues, what we want to be able to do is teach you how to use the whiteboard in the hallway to basically hit a button, switch to the whiteboard, and just add it to a list of PDCA opportunities. Things that challenges you had, struggles you had, what you were doing in there, so that we can follow back up with you and see what we can do tweaking wise on these to get them to work a little bit better as we go forward.
So Brandon, do you envision other departments follow suit and have their own knowns?
I wish I could sit here and say that absolutely within a year we want to push these out to everybody. The problem that we're running into is one of, and you guys, this isn't going to come as a shock, but Michigan Medicine in particular hits. We're not exactly at the forefront of technology, right? Just being honest. And so we bought these without permission, really, right? So they're not a supported device from a HITS perspective. So we're incorporating workarounds. We're working with ITS. We've gone to committees with HITS. We're jumping through all their hoops and doing everything we need to do. But we weren't gonna wait 3 years, 2 years for them to endorse and do something with us. We got them. We're coming up with a way to use them now. But one of the kind of the handshake deals that we've had to make is one that we aren't going to start speccing these on projects because they really aren't a HIT supported device. That said though, some of the work Louise is doing, bless his heart, is talking to U of M about our umich.edu logins and trying to work through angles with U of M and with campus to give us the flexibility to use that login on these screens, which will allow us to do things on these screens collaboratively without having a screen, okay? And so what that means is that you might be sitting at your desktop, and you just log in, you'll get, just like your payroll, you'll get an alert on your phone to accept, you'll get inside that way, and then once you've done that, every project whiteboard that you collaborated with anybody on knows it's you because of your umich.edu. It's brilliant in the experiments we're doing. The fail on it at the moment is this endorsement to universally allow us the flexibility to use that the way that we want to. So again, long answer, but only because what you say is exactly how we want it used. Maybe not on a hub device that we can't get fully vetted and permission on, but on any device, right? Which is actually a better situation and a better scenario, I think, longer term.
How is our campus counterparts?
So on campus, they use something called a Google Jamboard, which is essentially a nicer version of a screen like this. They are less than committed to saying, we're going to move past, this is on campus by the way, past the Jamboard and over to a Surface Hub in the short term. So they're tolerating our questions, and I think, I'm going to put in quotation marks, working with us to get to a solution on these things. But it's not like they're saying, oh my gosh, this is so much better than a Jamboard, let us stop all the work that we've done on Jamboards and switch over. But
they haven't said no.
They haven't said no, so we continue to move forward. Yep, go ahead.
Can we view Matterport files?
Yeah. You know what? You know what we'll do? Just because there's so many things that we can do on these, we can do them in the other room. Once we get in there and we start milling about, we can grab one of the screens and we'll log in and bring up a Matterport and scan right on there. The simple answer is yes. You can bring them up and do screenshots, drop them on the whiteboard, and mark them up if you wanted to.
And just one last thing to talk back about the paper stuff. This room used to be full of paper.
Yes, thank you.
Ah, you're right, Louise. Excellent. It's true, it was. It was the old archive room.
And none of that paper disappeared.
Yeah. Okay, so with that, we can go ahead and head down. Thank you, everybody, and thanks again.
No, she wasn't.
You know what, all of these people have those drawing files in their office? Because they tell me that the stuff that they need, they can't find in the archive. They tell me that 5 days a week. I can't find what I need in the archive. I can't find sheet E2 for project ABC.
Yeah.
I can't. All I have
No, you can't.
Right.
I guarantee you can't.
See, he said yeah.
But Dave, I remember one time down on the second floor of North Angle. Marilyn Pendler said the anger and down there.
That is now. Sugar. Yeah. Do you want to take these two that like the break room or maybe down there?
Yep, I absolutely will take them.